The unwanted bargain. The air in the council chamber was thick with tension. Lyanna stood in the center of the grand hall, her hands clenched at her sides as the Earth's officials read the terms of the treaty. Their voices were dull, bureaucratic, emotionless. As if they weren't signing away her entire life. As part of the peace accord with the Zalari Dominion, one of the diplomats droned, "A human representative shall be sent to the Zalari homeworld as a bride to the reigning warlord, Zoran Valkaresh. This union will symbolize the unity between our species and..." Lyanna barely heard the rest. A bride? They were trading her like a piece of cargo. Her stomach twisted, but she refused to show weakness. She knew why they had chosen her. She had no political ties, no powerful family to protest her being shipped off to an alien warlord. And she had the skills they thought would make her valuable, an engineer who had worked on the war front, someone with a sharp mind and a body that could endure hardship. Someone expendable. The silence in the room was deafening as the final words of the treaty were spoken. It is done. The agreement is sealed. Lyanna forced herself to breathe. She was no one's prize. And if they thought she would go quietly, they were dead wrong. The departure. The Zalari transport ship loomed over the Earth spaceport, its sleek black hull reflecting the dim glow of the sun. Lyanna stood at the docking station, her few belongings packed into a small bag. She wasn't allowed to bring much, just the essentials. Not that she needed anything. She had already decided she wasn't going to be staying long. Two Zalari guards, towering and clad in obsidian armor, approached. Their reptilian features were eerily unreadable, their silver eyes watching her like a predator sizing up prey. "Human," one of them said, his voice deep and accented. "Come." Lyanna didn't move right away. She turned to the diplomat beside her, a man who hadn't even bothered to look her in the eyes since she was chosen. "Tell them something for me," she said, her voice steady. The diplomat blinked. "What?" She gave him a cold smile. "If they think this is going to be easy, they have no idea what they've just signed up for." And with that, she stepped onto the ship. Arrival on the Zalari homeworld. The planet of Vorkar Prime was unlike anything Lyanna had ever seen. Jagged mountains of dark stone stretched across the horizon, their peaks glowing with veins of molten lava. The sky was a deep violet, stars flickering even in daylight. Massive cities rose from the rocky terrain, their structures sharp and angular, built for war rather than beauty. The Zalari were not a people of peace. And yet, they had agreed to this union. Lyanna didn't believe for a second that it was out of goodwill. She was led through the fortress of the Warlord, an imposing citadel that seemed carved from the very bones of the planet itself. The air was thick with heat and the distant scent of burning metal. And then... she saw him. Zoran Valkaresh. The Warlord stood at the end of the great hall, his massive form draped in armor that looked as if it had been forged in the heart of a dying star. His dark, scaled skin shimmered under the glow of the torches, and his silver eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. This was the man she was supposed to marry. A predator. A warrior. A conqueror. And yet, there was something else in his gaze, something unreadable. He studied her, his expression unreadable. "You are the human they have sent?" His voice was deep, a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Lyanna lifted her chin. "I didn't exactly volunteer." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Good." She frowned. "Good?" He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I do not want a willing bride. I want a fighter." She clenched her fists. "Then you're in for a challenge." The smirk widened. "I certainly hope so." The Warlord's claim. The ceremony was brief, more of a declaration than a traditional wedding. In Zalari culture, a Warlord's claim was absolute. Once the bond was made, there was no escape. A cold dread settled in Liana's stomach as the metal cuff was placed around her wrist, the Zalari symbol glowing faintly. She had become bound to a warlord. But she was no prisoner. She would find a way to escape. And if Zoran thought she was going to play the role of obedient bride, he was in for a rude awakening. A cage of gold and fire. Liana had expected imprisonment. She had expected cruelty, perhaps even indifference. What she had not expected was luxury. Her chambers were massive, far grander than anything she had known on Earth. The walls were made of polished obsidian, glowing symbols carved into the stone like some ancient language of power. A sprawling balcony overlooked the jagged landscape of Vorkar Prime, the lava rivers below casting an eerie orange glow into the room. Everything was designed to be both beautiful and unyielding, just like the man who had brought her here. Zoran Valkaresh. Her warlord, husband. Her captor. Liana ran a hand along the cold metal cuff on her wrist, its faint glow pulsing in time with her heartbeat. It was a Zalari bonding mark, meant to signify loyalty, ownership. She gritted her teeth. That would not be happening. The warlord's expectations. Liana had spent the last hour pacing when the door to her chambers slid open without warning. Zoran entered, his imposing figure blocking out the light from the corridor behind him. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. Do Zalari not believe in knocking? His silver eyes gleamed with amusement. This is my fortress. I have no need to ask permission. She scowled. Then maybe I should start locking the doors. You could try, he mused, stepping closer, but it would not stop me. Her jaw tightened. If you think I'm going to be an obedient little bride, you're mistaken. His expression didn't change, but there was something dangerous in his gaze. You assume I want obedience. Liana frowned. Don't you? Zoran tilted his head, considering her. A willing mate is desirable. A weak one is not. She scoffed. Good news, then. I have no plans to be either. His lips twitched as if he found her amusing. Then you will fit here better than you think. She wasn't sure what that meant, but she didn't like the way he said it. Then, his tone shifted. Your presence here is more than symbolic, human. You will adapt to our ways, or you will suffer the consequences. Liana straightened. I'm not afraid of you. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a near growl. You should be. Her heart pounded, but she refused to back down. Then, as if satisfied by her defiance, Zoran smirked. Your training begins tomorrow. She blinked. Training? He turned toward the door. You wish to resist me? Good. Then you will prove you have the strength to stand among my people. Before she could respond, he was gone. Training? What the hell had she just gotten herself into? A test of strength. The next morning, Liana was led to an open-air training ground within the fortress walls. Zalari warriors trained in pairs, their bodies moving with lethal precision as they sparred with electrified staffs. It was clear that combat wasn't just tradition here. It was survival. Zoran stood at the center of the arena, waiting. When she approached, he tossed a weighted staff at her feet. She stared at it, then back at him. You're joking. He arched a brow. You wish to prove you do not belong in a cage, human? Then fight. She narrowed her eyes. I'm an engineer, not a warrior. Then you will learn. She hesitated. This wasn't a fight she could win. The Zalari were taller, stronger, built for battle. But giving up? That wasn't an option. She picked up the staff. The training was brutal. Zoran didn't hold back. Every strike was fast, merciless, meant to break her defenses. She barely dodged in time, her muscles screaming in protest as she struggled to keep up. By the time she collapsed onto the sand, gasping for breath, Zoran stood over her, unimpressed. Pathetic. She glared at him, sweat dripping down her face. You will not survive here if you do not adapt, he said. Try again tomorrow. Liana clenched her fists. She hated him. But she hated losing more. So when the next morning came, she was there. And the next. And the next. She trained until she could block his attacks. Until she could land a strike of her own. Until she could stand tall, unyielding. And for the first time since she arrived, she saw something in Zoran's eyes she hadn't before. Respect. Whispers of rebellion. Days turned into weeks. The fortress was alive with tension. Something was wrong. Liana noticed the way Zoran's warriors whispered when they thought no one was listening. The way the guards doubled at night. The way Zoran himself seemed restless, his sharp gaze always scanning the horizon as if expecting an attack. One evening, as she walked through the halls, she overheard two Zalari speaking in hushed tones. She is the reason they will come. The humans are weak. She is nothing. And yet the prophecy. A sharp hiss. The Warlord will not allow it. He will kill them first. Liana's pulse quickened. Prophecy? Before she could listen further, a rough hand grabbed her wrist. She spun, coming face to face with Zoran himself. His silver eyes burned with warning. You should not be here. I wasn't the one talking about prophecies, she shot back. His grip tightened just slightly before he released her. Stay out of this, he said. But Liana had never been good at obeying orders. Something was coming. And she needed to find out what before it was too late. Whispers of rebellion. Liana had never been good at ignoring danger signs. And the Zalari fortress was full of them. The murmurs in the hallways. The tightened security. The way Zoran's soldiers kept glancing at her as if expecting something to happen. Something was brewing. And it had everything to do with her. A captive in plain sight. Since her forced arrival on Vorker Prime, Liana had been treated more like a high-value prisoner than a wife. Her chambers were grand, but they were still a cage. The fortress was a fortress, but it was still a battlefield. And her so-called husband? He was a warlord first. A husband last. If he even saw her as that at all. The only difference now was that the air between them had changed. The training sessions had made her stronger, and though Zoran still overpowered her easily, he no longer looked at her like a fragile human meant to be protected. But that didn't mean she trusted him. Because something was wrong. And she was determined to figure out what. The Warlord's secret meetings. For 3 nights in a row, Zoran had disappeared without explanation. Not for military strategy meetings, those were held openly in the war chambers. Not for war games with his officers, she had seen those, too. No, these meetings were different. Secretive. And Liana had learned long ago that secrets meant danger. So, on the 4th night, she followed him. She moved through the dark corridors, sticking to the shadows, keeping her breath steady. The fortress had many levels, many hidden passages. She had spent weeks mapping out the ones that weren't guarded. It led her to a lower chamber, one carved deep into the rock, hidden away from the main halls. She pressed herself against the stone, listening. The humans will not sit idly by. It was not Zoran speaking, but another voice, deep, urgent. We secured the treaty to prevent another war, Zoran replied, his tone sharp. And yet, even now, my own people plot against it. Liana's pulse quickened. There was opposition. Of course, there was. The Zalari had conquered world after world. They had no history of peace treaties. So why would everyone suddenly accept a truce? Unless. It is the human woman, the other Zalari said. Liana's breath caught. They see her as a weakness. As a danger. Zoran was silent. Then, finally, he spoke. And what do you see her as? A pause. Then. I see her as the storm before the war. Liana clenched her fists. She had known this wouldn't be easy. But she had underestimated just how much danger she was truly in. A warning from an unlikely source. She wasn't the only one listening. As she turned to slip away, a hand suddenly clamped around her arm, yanking her back. She barely bit back a gasp as she was dragged into the shadows. The grip loosened, and she spun to face her captor, only to find a Zalari woman standing there, her piercing gold eyes staring her down. She had seen this woman before. One of Zoran's high-ranking officers. The woman tilted her head. You are bold, human. Liana's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. You know my name. Yes. The woman studied her. And you should know that there are those who would see you dead before this treaty is solidified. I figured that out already, Liana muttered. The Zalari officer smirked slightly. Then know this, there is a faction that believes you are the Bride of Ruin. Liana frowned. The what? The woman's expression turned serious. An ancient prophecy. One that speaks of a foreign bride who will bring either salvation or destruction to the Zalari. Some believe you are a sign of peace. And the others? The officer's golden eyes darkened. They believe you are a curse. Liana felt a chill creep down her spine. She had thought she was simply a political pawn. But now? She was something far more dangerous. The Warlord's warning. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the faint glow of the bonding cuff on her wrist. Bride of Ruin. What did that even mean? Before she could dwell too long, the door to her chambers slid open. Zoran. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at her, his silver eyes unreadable. You were in the lower halls, he finally said. Liana lifted her chin. You didn't forbid me from walking the fortress. His gaze sharpened. Do not play games with me, human. She stood. Why don't you tell me the truth instead? About the prophecy. About the rebellion. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. You should not concern yourself with such things. She laughed bitterly. Not concern myself? They think I'm some kind of curse. I'd say that's pretty damn relevant to me. Zoran exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. Then, he stepped closer. The Zalari do not believe in fate, he said. We believe in power. In conquest. Then why does this prophecy scare them so much? For a long moment, he was silent. Then, he murmured, because the last prophecy about a warlord's bride ended in the fall of a great empire. Liana's blood went cold. She wasn't just a political pawn. She was a symbol. A threat. And if she didn't figure out how to survive, she might not live long enough to see how this played out. The warlord's choice. Liana had spent her entire life believing she was in control of her own fate. Now, she wasn't sure if that had ever been true. The prophecy. The whispers of rebellion. The way Zoran's enemies saw her as a curse, a symbol of their empire's downfall. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was a target. And the worst part? She still didn't know where Zoran truly stood. Was he her captor? Her protector? Or something far more dangerous? A fractured empire. Tensions in the fortress were rising. Even without the whispers, Liana could feel the shift. The soldiers were restless, their training sessions more brutal, their patrols doubled. Something was coming. She saw it in the way Zoran moved, more rigid, more on edge. He still trained her, still pushed her to fight harder, faster, but there was something else behind his silver gaze now. a weight pressing on him. She needed answers. And for once, Zoran wasn't avoiding her. Confronting the Warlord. She found him in the war chamber, standing over a massive holographic display of Vorker Prime cities. The blue light flickered over his face, casting harsh shadows across his sharp features. Liana crossed her arms. Tell me the truth. Zoran didn't look up. You'll have to be more specific, human. The rebellion, she said. The prophecy. The fact that your own people want me dead. How much worse is it than you're letting on? He was silent for a moment, then sighed. Then, to her surprise, he gestured for her to come closer. Liana hesitated, then stepped forward. The holographic display shifted, zooming in on a sector she didn't recognize. Dozens of red markers blinked over the landscape. The faction that opposes this treaty is not small, Zoran admitted. And they are not without influence. Liana swallowed. So, what? They want me dead to stop the alliance. Zoran's gaze darkened. They believe that if you live, our empire will fall. And they are not willing to take that risk. She exhaled slowly. And you? What do you believe? For the first time, Zoran met her gaze fully. I believe, he said, voice steady, that fate is nothing but a story fools tell themselves to excuse their weakness. She frowned. That's not an answer. His silver eyes held hers. No, it is not. A dangerous proposition. Liana knew she had two choices. She could wait. Do nothing. Hope that Zoran's influence was enough to keep her alive. Or she could act. The next morning, she walked into the training grounds not as a reluctant prisoner, but as someone with a purpose. Zoran raised an eyebrow as she picked up the training staff without waiting for instruction. You're eager today, he mused. She twirled the staff in her hands. I need to learn faster. He studied her for a moment. Why? Liana tightened her grip. Because if I'm going to be at the center of this war, I refuse to be the weakest piece on the board. Something flickered in Zoran's eyes. Not amusement. Respect. Then, he moved. Their sparring sessions were brutal. Zoran never let her hold back, and he never treated her as fragile. She was bruised. Sore. But she was improving. And that was what mattered. The assassin in the dark. The attack came that night. Liana woke to the sound of footsteps, too soft, too careful. Her instincts screamed. She rolled off the bed just as a blade slashed down where she had been lying. A Zalari assassin. The glint of a curved dagger. The eerie glow of dark armor. Liana barely had time to react before the assassin lunged again. She grabbed the first weapon she could, one of the decorative blades from the wall, and swung wildly. The assassin dodged easily, knocking her backward. Pain exploded through her ribs as she hit the floor. She scrambled up, heart pounding, mind racing. Then. A blur of silver and black. Zoran. He moved faster than she had ever seen, his blade cutting through the air like lightning. The assassin barely had time to react before Zoran's sword plunged into his chest. A choked gasp. A flash of silver blood. Then silence. Zoran's breathing was steady as he pulled the blade free, his expression unreadable. Liana's hands trembled as she pressed against the wall, catching her breath. Zoran turned to her. They are no longer waiting, he said grimly. She swallowed hard. Then neither will we. The battle had begun. And Liana was ready. The Warlord's bride. Liana had spent weeks trapped in this fortress, treated as a political pawn, a fragile human among warriors. Not anymore. The assassination attempt had been a turning point. The rebellion was no longer a distant whisper, it was here, in the shadows, waiting to strike again. She was done being a target. If she was going to survive, she needed to stop being a weakness. She needed to become something else entirely. A lesson in war. The morning after the attack, Liana didn't wait for Zoran to call for her. She marched into the training grounds, ignoring the bruises on her body, ignoring the lingering fear in her mind. Zoran stood waiting, his arms crossed, his silver eyes watching her carefully. "You should be resting," he said. She lifted the training staff. "Teach me something new." A flicker of something, amusement, approval, crossed his face. Then, without warning, he attacked. Their fights had always been brutal, but today was different. Today, Zoran didn't hold back. He pushed her harder, faster, his strikes precise, unrelenting. And Liana? She adapted. She moved differently now, no longer just reacting, she was thinking, strategizing. By the end of the session, she was panting, drenched in sweat, but she had managed something new. She had landed a hit. It wasn't much. A small strike to his side. But when Zoran looked at her, there was something different in his gaze. Not just respect. Something more. A shift between them. Things between her and Zoran had always been tense, but now the air between them felt charged in a different way. She had always thought of him as her captor, her enemy. But he had saved her life. And he was teaching her how to save herself. One night, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the fortress, she felt his presence before she saw him. "You fight differently now," he said. She turned. He stood just behind her, arms folded, the moonlight casting sharp shadows on his face. "I fight to survive," she said. Zoran studied her. Then, quietly, he said, "You fight to win." She wasn't sure what to say to that. And then, before she could think too much about it, she asked, "Why did you agree to this alliance?" Zoran was silent for a long time. Finally, he exhaled. "Because I was tired of endless war." She stared at him. It wasn't the answer she had expected. But maybe she had misjudged him. Maybe there was more to Zoran than just the warlord. The rebellion strikes. The next attack wasn't subtle. It came in the middle of a war council meeting. A bomb. Liana barely had time to react before the explosion tore through the chamber, sending flames and debris flying. She hit the ground hard, her ears ringing, smoke filling the air. She coughed, forcing herself up. The chamber was in chaos, Zalari warriors shouting, some injured, others already regrouping. Then. A flash of movement. More assassins. Liana didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest weapon, a fallen soldier's blade, and turned just as one of the rebels lunged at her. The fight was messy. Desperate. But Liana had been training for this. She dodged, countered, struck back with everything she had. And for the first time, she didn't feel like prey. She felt like a warrior. The warlord's vow. When the battle finally ended, the fortress was still standing. But barely. Zoran found her in the wreckage, his silver eyes dark with fury. "They will not stop," he said. Liana, still gripping the bloodied blade, nodded. "Then we don't give them the chance." Zoran stepped closer. "You realize what that means?" She met his gaze. It meant war. It meant standing beside him, not just as a political tool, but as something more. A partner. A queen. She took a deep breath. Then, she nodded. "I'm ready." Zoran studied her, then, slowly, he reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady. And for the first time since arriving on this planet, Liana knew exactly where she stood. Right at the warlord's side.